Welcome to my channel Limelight Leaks. Please share and subscribe, and hit the bell icon for latest updates.
In NASCAR racing, nobody was as clever and sneaky as Smokey Yunick. Fans loved him because he was super smart. Officials hated him because he caused trouble. In history, he's known as a guy who mixed being creative with breaking rules. He always had a cigar in his mouth and a smile that said, "Try to catch me if you can." Henry Yunick was born in 1923. People called him Smokey. He wasn't just a regular car mechanic. He was like a wizard with cars. During World War II, he flew big bomber planes. After the war ended, he learned to be careful and brave. He used these skills when he opened his car garage in Daytona Beach, Florida. His garage sign said Smokey's best garage in town. That wasn't just words on a sign. It was like he was daring everyone to beat him. Smokey became famous really fast for building race cars that didn't just win races, they beat everyone else so badly it was embarrassing. He didn't care about playing fair. He cared about playing smart. To Smokey, the NASCAR rulebook wasn't like a law he had to follow. Instead, he saw it as a big puzzle game he could solve. Every time the rule book had unclear words or didn't explain something perfectly, Smokey saw it as a chance to be tricky. Smokey once said, "I didn't cheat. I just found creative ways to read the rules." And here's the thing, he was telling the truth. If the rule book didn't say he couldn't do something, then Smokey went ahead and did it anyway. He made fuel lines as long as garden hoses. His cars would pass all the safety checks, but then they would zoom around the track like rocket ships. He was the best at finding tiny gaps in the rules and using magic tricks to fool people. But Smokey wasn't just playing games for fun. He was actually helping NASCAR racing get better and more advanced over time. Many of the smart tricks and new ideas that Smokey came up with first were later used by other NASCAR teams. Even though they were banned for years at first, things like better cooling systems, making cars more wind-friendly, and putting engines in different spots, he saw possibilities that other people wouldn't even think to look for in a million years. While most car builders were scared of the NASCAR officials, Smokey actually loved getting into arguments with them. He would dare the inspectors to try and find his secret tricks. He would call them stupid right in front of everyone. And when they finally did catch him doing something sneaky, he'd drive his car right out of the garage without even having a gas tank in it. This wasn't just some regular mechanic working on cars. Smokey Yunick was like a one-man army fighting against all the rules. Over the next 9 stories, we'll show you exactly how he was smarter than NASCAR officials and became the rebel king of all racing. This is the most famous story that shows what Smokey Yunick was all about. It's the time he found a tiny gap in the rules and turned it into a NASCAR legend that people still talk about today. This happened back in the 1960s, and it started with something simple that everyone in racing knows. In car racing, having gas means having power and having a good plan. More gas means you don't have to stop for more gas as often. Fewer stops to get gas means you can stay in first place for more laps around the track. And Smokey found a way to make this happen without breaking even one single written rule. Back then, NASCAR had a very strict rule about how much gas a car's gas tank could hold. Exactly 22 gallons. No more than that. So, Smokey didn't mess around with the actual gas tank at all. Instead, he just made the fuel line much longer than normal. While most race cars had just a few feet of hose running from the gas tank to the engine, Smokey wound up 11 feet of 2-inch wide fuel line all through the car's metal frame. This extra long fuel line held more than 2 extra gallons of gas, hidden where nobody could easily see it. This meant his car technically did have a 22-gallon tank just like the rules said, but in reality it could carry almost 24 gallons total. During a race, that tiny advantage meant staying on the track longer, moving ahead of other cars, and most importantly, winning the race. When NASCAR inspectors figured out his trick, they were really mad. They pulled the gas tank right out of his car, threw it on the ground, and said the car was illegal and couldn't race. Smokey stood nearby with a big grin on his face. Then, in a moment of pure showing off, he jumped into his car that now didn't have a gas tank anymore, and started it up. The engine roared to life, and with smoke coming out the back, he drove the car right out of the inspection area. Remember, his car didn't have a tank anymore. He was driving it using just the gas that was still left in that long fuel line. That single act wasn't just brave. It was genius-level defiance. It showed how sloppy and poorly written NASCAR's rules were and how far ahead Smokey was thinking compared to everyone else. After that embarrassing incident, NASCAR had to rewrite their entire rule book to limit fuel line volume, how long fuel lines could be, and even where they could be placed inside the car. All of this happened thanks to one man who was playing chess while everyone else was just playing simple checkers. But Smokey was only getting started with his rule-breaking adventures. By the middle of the 1960s, Smokey Yunick's reputation was well-known and well-earned for being a troublemaker. NASCAR inspectors had started to check every single inch of his cars very carefully. But Smokey wasn't just one step ahead of them. He was actually 5 steps ahead. And nowhere was this more obvious than the famous story of the legendary 7/8 scale Chevelle car. The 1967 Chevrolet Chevelle was really popular with fans, and Smokey saw lots of possibilities in it, but he also saw it as a challenge to make it even better. The car in its normal factory form was a little too boxy and square, a little too heavy, and not quite wind-friendly enough for what he had pictured in his mind. So, he decided to shrink the whole thing. He made it subtly, carefully, just enough smaller to make a big difference in performance. He rebuilt the entire car to be slightly smaller than what the rules said it should be, about 7/8 the size of a regular stock Chevelle. It wasn't small enough that you'd notice just by looking at it casually, but it was just enough smaller to cheat the wind and go around corners much better. Every single panel on the car was made by hand from scratch, every angle was adjusted perfectly, and every curve was reshaped to make it look like a normal stock car, but move like something out of a science fiction movie. When Smokey rolled his car into the inspection area, it passed all their tests. Officials measured the car from front bumper to back bumper. But they didn't measure every cross-section of the car. They didn't measure the width or the wheelbase from enough different reference points. Smokey had guessed that they would be lazy about their measuring, and he'd built his car to take advantage of exactly that laziness. Once his car got on the track, the Chevelle flew around like it had wings. It had better top speed, less air resistance, and much tighter handling around turns. Other drivers and teams couldn't believe what they were seeing with their own eyes. The car didn't just win races. It made the competition look embarrassing. When NASCAR finally figured out what was going on, they couldn't prove it. The car had passed all of their official checks and tests. Smokey just smiled and said, "I didn't cheat. They just didn't measure it the right way." The smaller Chevelle became legendary, and NASCAR had to rewrite their rule book once again. Smokey's message was crystal clear to everyone. If the rule book doesn't say you can't do something, then by all means, you absolutely can do it. Now we're back to the topic of fuel again. But this time, Smokey didn't bother with fuel lines or gas tanks. Instead, he looked at the basic structure of the race car and asked a question that no one else was brave enough to ask. What if I filled the roll cage with gasoline? In most stock cars, the roll cage is a system of thick metal tubes. These tubes are designed to protect the driver if the car crashes and flips over. The tubes are hollow inside and normally completely empty. But Smokey saw this as an opportunity, another secret place to store extra fuel that wasn't regulated by any rules. He welded all the tubing to make it completely airtight, installed a hidden inlet, and filled the entire roll cage with gasoline. The result was a secret backup fuel system that couldn't be seen from the outside, couldn't be measured because no one even thought to look there for hidden gas. During a race, the fuel would be sucked out from the roll cage to help supply the main gas tank. Once again, Smokey had found a way to run longer, stop less often, and win more races. And once again, NASCAR didn't have any rule against doing this. At least not at that time. Eventually, one inspector noticed an unusually strong smell of gasoline around Smokey's car, even after the car had run out of gas in the main tank. They followed the smell, traced all the fuel lines, and finally figured out what he was doing. The officials were completely shocked and stunned. Smokey just shrugged his shoulders like it was no big deal. He said there wasn't any rule against it, so why shouldn't he do it? From that moment forward, NASCAR created new regulations about what could be used to store fuel and exactly where fuel could be stored in race cars. But once again, the sport had been outsmarted and outfoxed by one clever man. Smokey Yunick wasn't just building regular race cars. He was building challenges to authority that ran on 4 wheels under pressure at 200 miles per hour. To him, NASCAR and its rule book was just his personal playground where he could have fun. By this point, Smokey Yunick had built a reputation not just as a mechanic, but as a master magician who used tools instead of magic ones. If a car looked legal and normal from the outside, most inspectors would give it the green light to race. Smokey counted on exactly that lazy attitude. In one of his most clever stunts, he used an idea called body offsetting. The concept was really simple. Shift the entire body of the car slightly to the left on the chassis underneath. Why would he do this? Because most NASCAR tracks back then were ovals where cars only turned left. A car that was weighted and angled to the left could go around corners faster, stay stuck to the track better, and reduce tire wear on those endless left-hand turns. So Smokey did exactly that. He mounted the car body off-center, but so subtly that it wouldn't be noticed without very precise measurement tools. To your eye, the car looked completely normal and balanced. From the side, it appeared perfectly balanced, but when it was moving, it stuck to the inside line of the track like glue. This off-center setup changed where the car's center of gravity was located, increased downforce on the inside tires, and gave his drivers incredibly sharp handling when going around turns. Competitors couldn't believe how hard his cars could take corners without sliding around or losing grip on the track. It seemed impossible, but it kept happening race after race. Of course, NASCAR eventually caught on to what he was doing. They started measuring chassis alignment compared to the wheel wells and suspension mounting points. Cars had to be centered according to very strict tolerances with no room for error. But the damage was already done. Smokey had already used this trick to steal wins and force NASCAR to rewrite the rule book again. In a post-race interview, when a reporter asked him about whether his setup was legal, Smokey said with a smirk, "Well, the rule says the body has to be on the chassis." It didn't say exactly where on the chassis. He didn't just build cars for racing. He built puzzles for officials to solve. Every time NASCAR thought they figured out one puzzle, Smokey had already built the next one. While Smokey Yunick was famous for big, bold tricks that got lots of attention, some of his most effective cheating methods were almost completely invisible to the naked eye. Aerodynamics weren't well understood in NASCAR's early years, and Smokey knew that fact. So, he took advantage of it with small, clever body changes that added up to really big results. He would tilt the windshield a few degrees farther back to reduce air resistance. He would tuck the front bumper in slightly and make the bottom of the car smoother to let air flow faster underneath the car. These changes weren't flashy or obvious, but they made his car cut through the air like a sharp missile flying through the sky. Then there were what he called the massage panels. Smokey would very subtly reshape the metal bodywork of the car, pulling in the sides, curving the rear quarters differently, and making the roof line narrower by just millimeters. All of this gave his car a much smoother aerodynamic profile, without ever drawing any attention from inspectors. These modifications weren't violations of any written rules. They were violations of what people expected cars to look like. Inspectors didn't bring wind tunnels to test aerodynamics. They just brought tape measures to check dimensions. And Smokey knew exactly how to beat both types of inspection methods with his modifications. At Daytona Speedway, one of his cars reached top speeds that were almost 5 miles per hour faster than the rest of the field. No one could figure out why his car was so much faster until years later when engineers finally understood what Smokey had done all those years before. He had been way ahead of his time in understanding aerodynamics. He also added what he called kick-ups, tiny bends in the rear fenders that worked like basic spoilers to help the car stick to the track better. NASCAR had no understanding of this concept back in the 1960s. But Smokey did. He was thinking years ahead of everyone else in the sport and using advanced concepts before anyone else knew they existed. Eventually, NASCAR created a template-based body inspection process to make sure all car shapes were standardized and identical. But this only happened after Smokey had embarrassed them multiple times with science and engineering that they didn't yet understand or grasp. He wasn't just breaking their rules. He was literally writing the future of racing. Among all of Smokey Yunick's amazing mechanical inventions, this next one sounds like something from science fiction, the so-called vapor carburation system. In theory, it was a way to turn liquid gasoline into vapor before it went into the engine, which would allow for much more efficient burning, better gas mileage, and higher performance while using less fuel overall. Most regular car engines burn liquid fuel that gets sprayed into the cylinders. But Smokey wanted to burn vapor instead, a fine mist that was perfectly atomized and spread out evenly. The result would be more power, less waste, and a huge drop in how much fuel the car used. This was revolutionary thinking for that time period. In the 1970s, during the height of the fuel crisis when gas was expensive and hard to get, Smokey reportedly installed this vapor carb system on a Pontiac Fiero prototype car. According to people who saw it, the car got over 50 miles per gallon, which was completely unheard of at that time. Nobody believed it was possible. The system used heat from the engine to convert liquid fuel into vapor, which then went into a modified intake system that he had redesigned. Smokey claimed that the car could drive all the way from Daytona Beach, Florida to Detroit, Michigan on just a single tank of gas. That would be an incredible distance for any car back then. Naturally, this story attracted a lot of doubt and suspicion. Big oil companies, big auto manufacturers, and government regulators, everyone had their own reasons to try to discredit him and make people think he was lying. The system was never sold to the public, and Smokey got frustrated with all the politics and eventually walked away from the project. NASCAR heard about his vaporization ideas earlier in his racing career and quickly banned any such system from being used in competition races, but they never explained why they banned it. Today, the vapor carb system is legendary, not just as a racing trick, but as a possible key to the future that got buried before it had a chance to change the world. Some people say it's just a myth and never really worked. Others believe that Smokey simply invented something too advanced too quickly and scared the wrong powerful people. Either way, it was classic Smokey behavior. One part pure genius, one part rebellion against authority, and always way ahead of everyone else's thinking. By this point in his career, Smokey Yunick had already proven he could outsmart almost anyone working in a garage anywhere in the country. But when NASCAR began cracking down hard on fuel tank size and how far cars could go in races, Smokey came up with one of his boldest and most ridiculous tricks yet. A magnetic fuel pickup system designed to fool inspectors. The problem he faced was this: NASCAR officials were now inspecting fuel tanks very carefully before races, making absolutely sure that cars didn't carry more fuel than the rules allowed. The solution? Smokey rigged up a magnet-based system that would shut off part of the fuel pickup line during the official inspection process. But once the race started and Smokey's crew secretly removed the hidden magnet, all the remaining fuel could freely flow back into the system like normal. It gave his car several more laps worth of fuel, all completely off the official books and records. Smokey's cars could now outlast all the competition without needing an extra pit stop. This was often just enough of an edge to steal a win or grab the lead when it mattered most in the final laps of a close race. When NASCAR caught on to this trick, they were absolutely furious about it. The magnetic trick wasn't technically illegal at the time since there was no rule against it, but it was dishonest, and more importantly, it was working perfectly. Officials had to completely revise their inspection protocols and rewrite yet another rule, just to stop Smokey's latest sleight of hand magic trick. The beauty of the magnetic pickup system wasn't just in what it accomplished. It was in how perfectly it aligned with Smokey's life philosophy and approach to everything. If the rule book doesn't say you can't do something, then you absolutely can do it. Smokey wasn't just racing cars against other cars on the track. He was racing his mind against other people's minds, and he was winning almost every single time. His brain was his most powerful engine, and it never seemed to run out of fuel. One of Smokey Yunick's most famous and subtle innovations was a trick involving suspension height manipulation, a way to beat NASCAR inspections without anyone catching on until it was way too late to do anything about it. Here's exactly how this clever system worked step by step. NASCAR rules said that a car had to meet minimum height requirements during the official inspection process. This rule was meant to ensure fairness between all teams, prevent illegal lowrider cars, and make sure no one was gaining an unfair advantage from underbody aerodynamics or excessive cornering grip that would be impossible for other teams to match. Smokey's response to this rule was brilliant. He built a suspension system that would compress and get lower after the inspection was over. Using a combination of pressurized components, specially tuned shock absorbers, and heat-sensitive materials, his cars would sit at the legal height when they were cold and not moving. But once the car hit the track, warmed up from racing, and experienced sideways forces from high-speed turns, the suspension would gradually settle lower. The car would drop just enough to improve aerodynamics and lower the center of gravity without anyone ever seeing it happen during the race itself. The car hugged the track much tighter, took turns much faster, and sliced through the air more efficiently. And nobody ever saw it happen because it was gradual and invisible. Officials would recheck the car after the race was over, and by then the suspension had cooled down, rebounded, or reinflated back to the regulation height automatically. Smokey had created a disappearing ride height trick that was like magic, one that fooled inspectors, confused competitors, and led to yet another rule rewrite by frustrated NASCAR officials. Later in his life, when a reporter asked him how he pulled off this incredible trick, Smokey smiled and said something very clever. He said, "Cars have feelings, too. Mine just happened to feel taller when the heat wasn't on." The disappearing suspension wasn't just amazing mechanical wizardry and engineering skill. It was also psychological warfare against his competitors. Smokey was winning races before the green flag ever dropped to start them. If there was one thing Smokey Yunick hated more than rules and regulations, it was outdated thinking and people who were afraid to try new ideas. And nowhere did he push boundaries harder than under the hood of his race cars. This brings us to one of his final and most ambitious projects ever attempted. He built an engine so far ahead of its time that NASCAR didn't even have a rule against it. Why? Because they didn't know it was even possible to build such a thing. Working closely with engineers at General Motors, Smokey developed a completely radical new engine design that had never been seen before in racing. The engine featured variable length intake runners, reverse flow cooling, and experimental valve timing that could be adjusted. The engine promised much higher power, much better fuel efficiency, and much greater temperature control. It was a trifecta of improvements that no one else could even come close to touching or matching. When he first showed up with the engine at a test session, officials were completely stunned by what they saw and heard. The engine didn't just outperform all the competition, it embarrassed them so badly it wasn't even close. Rival teams immediately protested and complained. NASCAR officials panicked and didn't know what to do. But here's the thing, Smokey hadn't broken a single rule. The problem was that he had built something the rule book had never imagined was possible. Instead of approving this amazing new technology and letting other teams try to catch up, NASCAR took the easy way out and banned the entire engine design outright. They called it unfair to other teams, even though it followed every single written guideline in their rule book perfectly. The real issue was simple. It gave Smokey such a huge lead that no one else could possibly catch up to him. It would have made racing boring because he would win everything. In interviews years later, Smokey said something that perfectly summed up his approach to everything. "I didn't cheat. I just read ahead in the textbook while everyone else was still on chapter 1. This wasn't just another loophole that he had found. It was the culmination of everything Smokey stood for throughout his entire career. It represented innovation, defiance against authority, and an unshakable belief that progress shouldn't have to wait for permission from people in charge. To this day, many of the features from that experimental engine have shown up in modern high-performance car designs. Smokey Yunick didn't just build illegal motors that broke rules. He built the future of racing technology. And by the time the rest of the world finally caught up to his level of thinking and engineering, he was already long gone, working on the next impossible thing that nobody else had even dreamed of yet. That was Smokey Yunick, always 5 steps ahead of everyone else in the game.